And the paper I had planned on presenting was going to be about perception and whether perception could be a source of reasons. And the answer was going to be no. So I'll just say that now. Spare you reading the paper. But what I want to talk about is a slightly different issue, still having to do with knowledge versus epistemology. And I think, there's sort of a question about what knowledge versus epistemology is supposed to be. And one way of thinking about knowledge versus epistemology is you can think of knowledge as being prior to other kinds of epistemic notions we care about. And I thought about maybe today talking about reasons, evidence, and their possession. But what I'm going to talk about today instead is status. And what I mean by status is something like a status that a belief can attain. So we talk about beliefs that are constitute knowledge, that's kind of status. Beliefs that are justified, that's kind of status. And beliefs that are rationally held, that's status. And what I'm going to do is sort of indirectly give a kind of argument for thinking that a knowledge-first approach to status is the right one. Whereas the usual orientation, right, is to think of, say, knowledge it's a kind of status, but it results from sort of attaining other statuses as well, like, say, a rational belief or justified belief and things like that. So one way of trying to argue that knowledge comes first when it comes to status is to try to argue for things like there couldn't be any justified beliefs unless there were beliefs that constitute knowledge, because justified beliefs are knowledge. That's a good view. Not the view I'm going to defend now. So one complaint that people have about this view, as wonderful as it is that this view that equates justified belief with knowledge doesn't vindicate certain kinds of internalist intuitions that people have. After all, there's a perfectly good sense in which knowledge is not an internalist notion, right? Because pairs of subjects who are the same on the inside, as it were, can differ radically in terms of what they know. So what I want to do is talk about not justification, because I do think justification is kind of a radically externalist notion. What I want to do is talk about rationality, because there seems to be in the literature sort of two thoughts about the relationship between rationality and justification. We have some people who think that they sort of come to the same thing. And because intuition suggests that rationality is a kind of internalist notion in the way that I'm going to suggest, right, that's supposed to lead to a kind of internalism of justified belief. So we imagine certain kinds of situations where we're quite tempted to say that the person is rational in their beliefs, or the beliefs are rationally held. It seems like the salient features of the case that make it the case that the beliefs rationally held are all features of their perspective in some sense. And then, right, since rationality and justification are the same thing, justification is also going to turn out to be sort of largely determined by features of your perspective. Now, I really don't like that way of thinking at all. And one of the reasons why I don't like that way of thinking at all is I think whether a belief is justified or not has to do a lot with whether it conforms to certain kind of norms that govern belief. And I think that, basically, that, there's no way that rationality is going to be the mark of norm conformity. So it seems like in the case of action, no matter how rationally you were when you performed the action, at the time of action, I think there's still going to be the possibility that the action violates various kinds of norms. So you wouldn't want to treat rationality as like the mark of, say, norm conformity in the case of moral assessment, definitely not the case of legal assessment, right? And I think in the case of epistemic assessment, we shouldn't think of rationality as the mark of norm conformity either. So I sort of think rationality and justification come apart. And I'm not the only kind of person who thinks that rationality and justification come apart, right? I mean, Goldman, his reliabilism, it's not an attempt to show that there's a reliability condition on rationally believing things, right? That's just not his view. He's the kind of person who would want to separate these two kinds of things. So I just want to focus on the thing that is supposed to be sort of the thing that's most clearly internalist, right? Bracketing issues about justification when I think about rationality. And, a natural way of drawing the line between internal-external knowledge counts as an externalist notion, right? Because it requires something like a proper fit between appearance and reality. And because of that, the stuff knowledge is made of, it isn't just in the head. It might seem clear to you that something is so, you have strong evidence that it's so, you might reason perfectly well, right? But for all that, the conclusion you draw might be false. If the conclusion you draw is false, then you're not a knower. If it seems, though, clear to you that something is true, and you have incredibly strong evidence for it, and you reason very carefully in concluding that something is true, it does seem like there's something good about believing what you do. And a lot of us are tempted to call this thing rationality. So if all of the available evidence supports P, it might be unreasonable for you not to believe P. And if that's right, then maybe it's just the stuff in the head that matters to rationality. not totally opposed to that. The gap between appearance and reality is a potential threat to knowledge, but that gap doesn't seem to be a direct threat to rationality. And you can make this vivid by thinking about the classic new evil demon case that Cohen uses. So your non-factic mental duplicate, let's say, is deceived by a Cartesian demon. Everything you see and remember, they seem to see and remember. Everything that strikes you as plausible strikes them that way too. There's no difference in the way that the two of you reason. You draw all and only the same conclusions. In spite of this, there's vast differences in what you know, but in spite of this, there doesn't seem to be vast differences in spite of what you rationally believe. And that suggests that neither the presence of a gap between appearance and reality, or the stuff that falls on the other side of the gap of appearance and reality has any direct bearing upon what's rationally believed. Okay. Perhaps this is because the absence or presence of such things doesn't have any bearing on what's intelligible from your point of view. So I think there's a natural explanation as to why rationality supervenes upon the mental. I think it's a popular one, and it's a kind of evidentialist explanation. The reason that facts about your mental states wholly determine whether it's rational for you to believe a given proposition is that facts about your mental states determine what evidence you have, and then if your evidence provides sufficiently strong support for your beliefs, they're just rational things to believe. If you believe on the basis of that evidence, right, they're rationally believed. So if they're rational, it's because they're supported by a sufficient degree to the evidence. Now, this kind of evidentialist explanation isn't uncontroversial, but it's also not unpopular. There's been a lot of debate about whether your evidence is the kind of thing that supervenes upon your non-factive mental states. So Duncan, for example, is the kind of person who I think would say that that's false, right? That there can be features of the circumstance that determine what evidence you have. Now, I happen to think Duncan's right about that, but I mean, this is like a controversial view. I'm just going to bracket that, right? Because I think that gets a lot of attention, but I think something that deserves more attention doesn't get enough attention. The second part of this kind of evidentialist explanation is not a claim about evidence supervening on the mental. Rather, it's the idea that evidential support relations wholly determine what's rational for you to believe. Right, so we can have our fights about sort of what the evidence is, right? So we can have fights about whether you and I have the same evidence, if like I'm in fake Barnum country and you're in real Barnum country or whatever, right? But setting those fights aside, you might sort of think, well, like, yeah, once we have two subjects with the same evidence, the very same things will be rational for them to believe. And right, it's because of facts about how strong their evidence supports a proposition that certain things are going to be equally rational for them to believe. Okay. Now, a crucial part of this evidentialist explanation, right, is something that's supposed to be stronger than the supervenience thesis, something that's supposed to explain the supervenience thesis, and it's kind of grounding thesis. The rational things are rational because they're the ones that get sufficient support from the evidence. It's a kind of grounding claim. I think a lot of people like that grounding claim, but I think it's worth asking whether it's true. I wouldn't ask, right, whether it's true, unless, of course, I came here to argue that it's false, right? Because it wouldn't be fun to be like, is this true? Yes, as we all agree, and then leave, right? It's only going to be fun if I try to argue the answer is no. I don't think we should think of epistemic rationality as merely a matter of strong evidential support. So my target in this paper is an evidentialist view that has three core commitments, and those are on the handouts, so dependence, priority, and structural sufficiency. So one thing you need, right, is the dependence thesis, which says that if you rationally believe things, you have evidence for that provides sufficiently strong support. So the idea is that evidentialism is supposed to cover all the cases. So for every case of rational belief, there's something that plays the evidence role, the evidence plays the supporting role, and it's because it provides sufficient support that thing counts as rational. I think there are counterexamples to dependence. I think just straightforward cases of self-knowledge are really hard to fit into the evidentialist model, but that's like a footnote point, not a I'm going to defend it point. There's also priority. Now this is another thing that I think deserves a lot of attention, right? So we have to ask, should we think of possession as evidence, as something that we understood independently of and prior to notions like rationality, or are we going to smuggle in status notions to make sense of possession? So someone like Williamson, right, in some sense rejects a kind of priority thesis because he uses knowledge to make sense of evidence possession instead of using evidence possession to make sense of knowledge. So there's a kind of priority thesis that he rejects, and rightly so, I say in the footnote. I'm not going to defend that here. But I think, right, so setting that stuff aside, right, surely structural sufficiency looks pretty good, right? All structural sufficiency says, if you have evidence for P that provides sufficiently strong support for P, then it's just rational to believe P. Or that's sort of a matter of like rational to believe things whether you do or not. And then if you believe on the basis of that evidence, it's rationally believed. So the simple idea is that rational beliefs are rational because there's strong evidential support for it, and that's just the thing that I think is problematic. And I didn't have this in the handout, but I think here's a sort of a helpful way to sort of imagine the view. I would have put this on the handout if I was better at making graphs. So if anyone's good at making graphs, here's the graph that I'd love for you to make and then let me use in the paper. It would have two axes, an x and a y, and along the horizontal axis would be the sort of points for the propositions you grasp. And then the vertical axes will just measure something like degree of evidential support. So at the top there's going to be a 1, at the bottom there's a 0, and 1 represents the maximal degree of evidential support for a proposition on your evidence, and 0 is the maximal degree of evidential disconfirmation. And that little line in the middle just means like your evidence sort of is 50-50. Right? Can anyone do this? If anyone can do this, definitely email me after the talk. So the picture I'm imagining is something like this. I mean, apologies for doing formal epistemology, but this is all you're going to get. There's just some line. It's above 0.5, right? Because no one thinks it's rational to believe P if your evidence supports P and not B equally. It's below 1 because nobody thinks that you have to have maximal confirmation for it to be rational to believe something. So there's just this line. If you want the line to like move a little bit because of the kind of proposition it is, like you could definitely do a fancier graph than this. If you want the line to be shiftable when certain kinds of things change, so like salient stakes or whatever, you want the line to go up or down, like, okay, fine, you can do a movable line, but the point is that we think, all right, as the evidence comes in, you move further and further away from this point, like positive evidence that confirms B, you move further and further from this point, and as long as you get above here, right, it's rational to believe that thing, like whether you do or not. And if you believe on the basis of the evidence that moves it up there, it's rationally believed. And that seems kind of good. And then you think, right, so suppose like this is P and this is Q, where Q is even further, right? It looks like, if we're going to make any sense of this idea of sufficient evidential support, it's got to be that if P, right, the distance from like here is less than the distance here, it better be that it's rational to believe Q if it's rational to believe P, right? Otherwise, like the notion of sufficiency probably doesn't really make any sense. I think sometimes when people say sufficiency, they just mean sufficient to rationally believe, or whatever, right? But that's kind of cheating. What we want is a notion of sufficiency where we don't use status notions to make sense of what it is. So I'm thinking of sufficient degree of support, sufficient strength of support, and I just want this little graph to measure it. That's all. So the underlying picture is something like you have some evidence, right? We're not worried about what it is. Your evidence supports various things. It supports things to various degrees. We can make comparative judgments about how strong evidence supports these various propositions. And as long as something crosses the baseline, it's rational. Now you might wonder, like, well, what about the relationships between P and Q, right? Well, like logical and probabilistic relationships between them constrain the way they go up and down. Yes, they will, right? And you could worry about that if you were trying to come up with a complete theory of rational belief, but I'm not. I'm just looking at theories of rational belief that incorporate something like those three theses: dependence, priority, and structural sufficiency. My aim is going to be to argue that structural sufficiency is false. Okay. So I want to introduce a puzzle, and the puzzle is something like this. So it's under the handout as the puzzle. There have been a lot of debates recently about what you might call the requirements of rationality, or rational requirements. And I don't mean rational requirements in that sort of technical sense, where people think sort of these wide scope requirements that through. I just mean requirements for believing things rationally. That's all. Just nothing. Just don't read too much into it. I'm just trying to find a way to talk about conditions under which it would be rational to believe things or not. So I think there's an interesting debate about lottery propositions. So on the handout I've got L. Like here's a view that I think some people probably have. If T's a ticket in a fair lottery that hasn't been drawn and there's more than 1 million tickets, you're rationally required to believe that that ticket is a losing ticket. In the absence of special evidence about various kinds of things. Here's another view that I think some people hold, but again, it's controversial. So not on the handout, but D, for a claim by disagreement. If you acknowledge that your peer disagrees with you about whether P, you're rationally required to refrain from believing P. So again, this is a kind of, we have these debates about whether acknowledged peer disagreement might rationally require you to suspend or something. That's the kind of thing I have in mind. Now, why do we debate these things? We debate these things because people pay us to debate these things, right? That's part of it. But part of it is we think that by thinking about these things and gathering the evidence, we might actually come to know something about what rationality requires. That's the optimist in me. And then the optimist in me thinks that when you come to know something about what rationality requires, you believe the thing and it's rationally believed. So far, so good. That seems like a possibility. So I think among the things that you might rationally believe, maybe not L, maybe not D, but maybe something like evidentialism, as defined in the paper, as the view that incorporates those three core commitments. I know a lot of people who think that they know that evidentialist view is true, and of course they think they rationally believe that evidentialist view is true. And I don't want to rule out the possibility that you might be rational in believing things about what rationality requires. So that all sounds good. And I think there are things like don't believe contradictions. That one looks pretty good. You're rationally required not to believe contradictions. I think we know that. I think knowing it means we rationally believe it. And of course, right, if then you want to make sense of that kind of intuition within the evidentialist framework, that means that there's something that plays the evidence role that raises these beliefs about what rationality requires, not just a little bit away from the baseline, right, but enough to get across the baseline. If you ask the evidentialists, right, is your view right? They'll say yes. But are you rational in thinking your view right? And they'll say yes. They'll say, do you know that your view is right? And they'll say, we don't care about knowledge, or something like that. But deep down inside, they feel like they know that these things are right. That's the kind of... So I know there are people who disagree with, they'll jump off right there, right? But I don't think we should jump off there. I think we should be open to the idea that some of the things we do with rationality are rationally believed. So my bold conjecture is that you could be the kind of person for whom this is true. Your evidence could provide sufficiently strong support for L, where so L is rationality requires you to believe lottery propositions. I think you're the kind of person who can get that evidence, so imagine the evidence points that direction. If you believe L on the basis of that, right, structural sufficiency tells us that you rationally believe L. So it's across the baseline, you believe on the evidence, and so you rationally believe it. And so, if so, it's hard to deny that you rationally believe that rationality requires you to believe that the ticket is a loser. Right? Because the only difference there is the difference between believing L, as it were, under that description of believing L, and then believing the content of L. Now, with this belief in place and with it getting its blessing from rationality, it's hard to see how rationality could then require you to refrain from believing that a ticket I just gave you is a loser. So it looks like we have this. You've got this proposition, the ticket you're holding is a loser. It looks like you rationally believe you're rationally required to believe that. Now, you can think about it this way. You're in the state of believing that rationality requires believing a proposition. And then you can think, right, so then what are my options? Well, one option would be just to believe the thing, right? Or one option is to believe the negation, right? Or one option is to neither believe the thing nor believe the negation. But I think some people think that once you're in this belief state, and it gets the sanction of rationality, that's the one that rationality is going to permit. And if that's right, then it looks like it would be rational for you to believe that the ticket is a loser. Okay, so far so good. Right? So you've thought about what rationality requires, you've got a rational view about that. You applied it to a particular case because I provided you all with imaginary lottery tickets, and now you believe that this ticket is a loser. So far, so good. And what could be wrong with that, right? Well, here's the turn, right? I didn't tell you anything about whether L is true or not, right? I just told you that you have arbitrarily strong evidence for L, and that you believe on arbitrarily strong evidence for L, and then you saw its implications, as it were, and you believe the ticket to be a loser. But why can't I just say at this point that L is false? That you're actually rationally required to refrain from believing lottery propositions? The problem with this is that it seems like I should be able to do that, but when you think about 4 and 5, it looks like you've got rationality saying, your belief that the ticket is a loser, I sanction that, but I require you not to have it. And it's hard to see how rationality can simultaneously sanction believing while mandating suspension, like on the very same proposition. So I think this is a puzzle, right? It's a puzzle because it's kind of hard to know what to say in response to this. And I'm going to describe various ways of trying to solve this puzzle. So, 3 responses. The first starts from the idea that the features of your perspective that make it rational, it's the features of your perspective that make it reasonable to believe things generally. And by making it rational to believe L, they thereby have an effect on whether it's rational for you to believe lottery propositions. So, according to the perspectivist, rationality requires a mesh between your beliefs and your beliefs about rationality. So they accept this thing that I'm calling the encratic requirement. Rationality requires you don't both believe you're rationally required to believe something and then refrain from believing it. It requires a mesh, right? If you think that rationality requires something of you, either get rid of that thing or make your underlying attitudes fit it. Keep them on the same page, as it were. So if features of your perspective make your beliefs about rationality rational, they'll help to determine whether it's rational for you to believe lottery propositions. So they would accept 1 through 4 and reject 5. Now the Encratic requirement actually implies it's not possible for certain kinds of mistaken beliefs about rationality to themselves be rational. So this is just a surprising little formal result that Mike Teitelbaum's proven in the paper. I think it looks kind of good. Basically, it looks like you can get an argument going from the Encratic requirement to this thing called the fixed point thesis. The slogan is that mistakes about rationality are mistakes of rationality. If you believe that rationality requires believing something, then that belief is either true or rationally prohibited. Now this is a surprising consequence, right? And a lot of people don't like surprises. But you might think, right, there could be rational mistakes about anything. Right? You make rational mistakes about the weather, you make rational mistakes about football. Right? Why isn't rationality one of those things? The best evidence might be misleading. If it's good enough evidence, it makes mistakes reasonable. And if you think strong but misleading evidence can make it rational to form mistaken beliefs about rationality, then you are what we call an incoherentist. An incoherentist is the kind of person who thinks that there can be rationally acceptable mismatches, where rationality, as it were, tells you, go ahead, like think this is what I require of you. Just whatever you do, don't fulfill that requirement. So it's going to permit situations where, as it were, you think you're rationally compelled to believe P, and it's fine to have that thought, provided you don't believe P. So rationality will sanction a mismatch. These are people who think that it's fine to stipulate that 5 is true in just the way that I did. It's fine to stipulate 1 is true in just the way that I did. And 1 does support 2 and 3. The way to solve this puzzle is reject 4. Alright, finally, the baddies in this paper. These are the objectivists. The objectivists agree with the perspectivists that rationality requires you to be encratic. Roughly, requires you to keep your beliefs about rationality and beliefs in line. But they disagree with the perspectivist about the rational significance of beliefs about rationality on our first-order attitudes. Objectivists think we should think of the requirements of rationality as independent targets that our attitudes aim to hit when we're thinking about rationality. And when our beliefs about rationality miss their targets, the miss is enough to make those beliefs irrational. So, like I said at the beginning of the paper, it might seem like the gap between appearance and reality doesn't have any direct bearing on rationality. It turns out in some special cases it does. When the beliefs happen to be about what rationality requires you in a particular situation, a mistake is just automatically going to count as irrational. You can tell me of evidence for the belief that turns out to be mistaken, I don't care. Your citing your evidence will just fall on deaf ears. By the way, just out of curiosity, do people have favorites yet? Like, how many people lean perspectivist? How many people lean coherentist? How many people are just like objectivism is obviously true? You save it for last. Okay. Maybe you'll fall in love with perspectivism along the way. Right, so perspectivists try to solve the puzzle by denying 5, the last step. So just very quickly, 2 arguments for it. The intelligibility argument starts with the observation that a rational response has to be intelligible from the subject's perspective. Subject's options always have to contain at least 1 rationally permitted option. Rationality can't reasonably require you to refrain from believing, refrain from disbelieving, and refrain from refraining. So suppose that your evidence strongly supports the belief you're rationally required to believe P. If so, you might think that the subject believes she's rationally required to believe P. This belief is going to be rationally permitted. Suppose that's right and that's what she believes, then we think about which combinations are rationally permitted. So one is believing not P, while believing you're rationally required to believe P. There's that combination. Or believing neither P nor not P when rationally believed. So there's this combination, and this combination. The idea is supposed to be that if you're in this kind of mental state, this kind of combination is supposed to be unintelligible, this kind of combination is supposed to be unintelligible. If rationality always permits at least 1 option, right, it looks like the only remaining option is going to be this one. But of course, if the only remaining option is that one, right, then it looks like we've vindicated the encratic requirement. So far, so good. And notice, right, the way we vindicated the encratic requirement, right? We started by showing the rationality of this belief. That closed off these options. That guaranteed the rationality of this one. So not only do we get the encratic requirement, we get the encratic requirement with a kind of top-down vindication. It's by making the higher order attitude rational, because of the evidential support, that this one becomes as rational as well. Okay. The second argument for perspectivism is kind of evidentialist argument. So evidentialists think that we should respect all the evidence, and that includes higher order evidence of various kinds. So suppose if only for reductio there's a counterexample to perspectivism. Such a counterexample would be, among other things, a counterexample to the encratic requirement. A situation in which what you ought to do, perhaps, is like have this belief, but then either believe the negation or believe nothing at all. Now, Feldman says, look, it seems like any case you think of, it's going to be a bad way to describe that case. And the reason it's going to be a bad way to describe that case is as follows. Suppose what makes this rational, right, is a high degree of evidential support. So there's a lot of evidence that supports believing that rationality requires believing P. Now what would make this not rational is a lack of evidential support. And Feldman says that's a terrible way to describe these cases because the evidence that constitutes evidential support for this belief would just constitute evidential support for this belief. So you can't get counterexamples to the incredible. The thing that, as it were, lifts up this one will just lift up that one. That's the evidentialist argument. I just want to very quickly say two things. One, that's just a terrible argument. I mean, so I shouldn't have said any names. Imagine someone had this terrible argument. So I'm going to explain why I think it's a terrible argument. I think once you see why it's a terrible argument, I think you can see that perspectivism is a dangerous evil view. Okay, so it's just a bit weird. It's a bit like, here's the problem with perspectivism. It's totally incompatible with this view that I hate. But once you see why it's incompatible with the view I hate, you'll see why perspectivism is not a friend to anyone. Okay. So, very quickly on the evidentialist argument. We're open to the possibility that a person can have arbitrarily strong evidence for various kinds of philosophical views. So, I mean, here's a philosophical view. It's a kind of view that pragmatists at various points have defended, which is that there are features a belief can have where even if the belief lacks evidential support, it could be rational to believe the thing for various kinds of reasons. So I know this is not a view that anyone we know has ever held, but you can imagine someone holding this view, which says that if you had a belief where not only does the evidence not speak one way or the other, but you kind of know in advance the evidence won't speak one way or the other, the having of it has lots of desirable consequences, then because of its desirable consequences, you're rationally required to believe it. Now, just a footnote, I mean, in the literature on epistemic consequentialism, like Perry Jenkins has these truth fairy kinds of examples. I can just report there are people who think we should bite the bullet on truth fairy kinds of examples. So there are people who actually hold views about epistemic rationality now, just like the one I'm saying very few people hold. Right? So maybe the belief is sort of like, if I believe that God exists in the absence of evidence, right, I'll get to go to Athena's amazing library in the afterlife, and that'll have tons of amazing epistemic consequences. Some people are not willing to bite that bullet and say, well, that feature's enough to make it rational to believe that thing. And it's just prejudice. Just prejudice on your part that you don't. Anyway, so you can imagine being locked up in the basement of one of these people, and they're just feeding you with these one-sided diet of arguments and intuition pumps, making it more and more rational for you to believe this pragmatist view of rationality. And then you think, right, well, as the evidence pours in for this crazy pragmatist view, it crosses a line. So I'm in the following state. I rationally believe that I'm required to believe P, but I do that in the knowledge that there's no evidence for P. But if I do it in the knowledge there's no evidence for P, how could it be that the evidence that supports this view about what rationality requires ensures that P is above the baseline? If by hypothesis, right, there's no evidence for P. So it just looks like one thing he overlooks is the possibility that you could get misleading evidence that would support an anti-evidentialist view of rationality. But if that's a possibility, then there's no way that the higher order evidence that supports views about rationality automatically triples down to support these lower order beliefs. And if that's right, then we should be able to get beliefs where one is up here and one's down there. So evidentialists have to reject the encratic requirement. And if that's not really sufficiently clear, I mean, you could change the example a little bit. Suppose you have arbitrarily strong evidence for the false proposition there's sufficient evidence for Q. Now, if you get arbitrarily strong evidence for the false proposition that there's sufficient evidence for Q, Q is going to be here, right? Just by hypothesis. But you're going to have arbitrarily strong evidence that Q actually resides up here. And if you know, quote unquote, that the evidentialist view is true, then it looks like you would be rationally required to believe, under the circumstances described, that rationality compels you to believe Q, but by hypothesis Q is below the line. So you might know that evidentialism is true, you might get misleading evidence about whether you have sufficient evidence for Q. Because the evidence is misleading, Q is down here, Because it's misleading, it's rational to think that it's up here, so you get the same kind of thing. It looks like evidentialism actually predicts that the encratic requirement is false, so you can't get evidentialist arguments for the encratic requirement. But once you see that, right, you can start to see why perspectivism is so dangerous. If you thought that the statements, I'm just going to go quickly because sort of time constraints, but if you thought the statements of the requirements of rationality are supposed to specify features that sort of make beliefs rational, or make suspension rational, or make disbelief rational, you start to worry a little bit, right? I mean, this kind of top-down reasoning that you can use to show that evidentialism is false, it looks like you could use that on just about everything, right? So we thought that there was a well-defined question. What should you do in response to peer disagreement? Or what should you do when you're given a lottery proposition? Or what should you do when your evidence only supports something to such and such a degree? Or, you know, if I believe P and Q, should I believe their conjunction? Right? You might have thought that these were sort of, as it were, well-defined questions, but you can't rule out the possibility you're going to get arbitrarily strong evidence, misleading evidence, about the significance of the features of things that you're aware of. So it's going to start to look like features of your situation will start to determine whether requirements of rationality actually apply to you in the first place. But this looks completely backwards, right? And the point of these rational requirements is to apply to you regardless of what your perspective on them is. I mean, they're supposed to be, in some sense, categorical. So I worry a little bit about the compatibility of thinking of rational requirements as categorical with views that sanction the kind of top-down reasoning that I've just given, because it seems like for any feature you like, where you think that feature is, say, necessary for rationality or something, you can construct these kinds of cases where you get arbitrarily strong evidence for the false claim about the significance of something. It'll turn out that that feature is not going to have rational significance at all. So just sort of by analogy, right? You know, imagine the legal case. There could be there are the laws out there, and the laws tell you what kinds of features make actions legal or illegal. It just looks like it's always going to be possible to get arbitrarily strong evidence that's misleading evidence about what the law requires. Right? Then you have to face a choice, right? Are we going to sanction, if we accept the encratic principle, it'll turn out those laws aren't laws at all. Right? That's the kind of worry that I'm worried about. Like I said, I'm moving quickly just because of time constraints. But once you see that, you think, right, so maybe incoherentism is a natural choice for evidentialism. A strong evidential support for beliefs but rationality doesn't invariably trickle down. Shouldn't we reject the encratic requirement? And that's what incoherentists think. Now, the name is a little bit abusive, but I came up with that because I thought it was a good view. So I was like, oh, this will be a fun view, and then I'll give it a funny name. So incoherentism was a view I kind of liked for a while. And then other people have defended it as well. So it's defended by, I think, Paul Coates and Maria Sonnen-Arnia. They think that structural sufficiency just shows us are going to be counterexamples to the fixed point thesis, cases in which there's sufficient evidential support for believing false things about the requirements of rationality. And since arguments against the fixed point thesis are just inter alia arguments against the encratic requirement, the incoherentist thinks we can solve the puzzle by rejecting this requirement. So we retain 5 and we retain 1 through 3. I think incoherentism is really hard on the intuitions. So I thought just to make it fun, I've sort of written a dramatic exchange between you and your epistemic conscience that's supposed to help you see how hard on intuitions incoherentism is. There's a longer version of it, but I had to edit it a bit. So your epistemic conscience walks in, it's like a little door in your mind where the little man in your mind, that's you, lives. Epistemic conscience comes in. Let's start with the bad news. These are the results of your periodic epistemic evaluation. A lot of your first-order doxastic responses have been flagged for irrationality. Do you want to start with the omissions or the commissions? And you say, omissions. Epistemic conscience, fine. You don't believe me? You. No, that's right. Right, I know you know that. See, it's irrational. You're rationally required to believe P. And you say, yeah, that seems right to me. And epistemic conscience says, yeah, no, I thought you'd say that. So you don't seem to remember, but I told you the same thing the last 3 visits. But, you know, here we are again. Look, if you don't agree with my assessments, you know, you can just tell me. I'm starting to worry you don't take this seriously. You say, no, on the contrary, I take this very seriously. I agreed with you then, and I agree with you now. So epistemic conscience says, so what gives? If you agree that it's irrational for you not to believe, why are you just sitting there? Why don't you get up and change your mind? And you say, well, I'm not sure that that's called for. I agree that it's not rational for me to refrain from believing P. I believe that. Really, that seems obvious to me. I just don't see that a change is called for. epistemic conscience says, is that because you're waiting for the good news? Because we've run the tests and your beliefs about rationality are all fine. They're all rational. And you say, oh, I expected as much. I mean, I'm absolutely certain my harder beliefs are all rational. Epistemic conscience says, oh, I've lost the thread. So you agree that it's irrational for you not to believe me. You agree that it's rational for you to agree with me on this point. And you acknowledge that you don't believe P and you don't see this calls for any sort of change. And you say to epistemic conscience, yeah, that's right. Epistemic conscience says, should we continue with these evaluations? And you say, yeah, they're really important. Okay, so you can start to see, I think there's something really worrisome here about the kinds of things that incoherentism says. And I think what this brings out is that when you discover mismatches, right, the discovery looks like the beginning of the process of epistemic self-assessment and belief revision. It doesn't seem like the end, right? But the defining characteristic of incoherentism is there can be these kinds of rational mismatches, where the way to stay within the bounds of rationality is to maintain the mismatch. So whereas I think a lot of us, our reaction to the discovery of a mismatch is to say that by itself shows that a revision is called for. That's not the incoherentist view. After all, there's nothing per se wrong with being emphatic on that view. There's another little thing, which, I mean, I'm not quite sure how much to make of this, but it does trouble me. So imagine someone believes evidentialism, right? I mean, most of the people who I think are in this sort of incoherentist view are sort of sympathetic to evidentialism. So they think, look, I've got sufficient evidence to believe that I'm rationally required to believe P, but I don't believe P. So this is the case we've liked in critical. So you've got this belief, allegedly it's rational, but you're in this state, right? Neither believing P nor not P. Now, I mean, if you're in the evidentialist mindset, you might think, look, why would I? Right? Again, you're not thinking about these weird pragmatists trapped in people's basements. Right? We're thinking about someone who's really in the grips of evidentialism. Right? Because most people who defend incoherentism, that's their view. The reason, right, it's rational for me to believe that rationality requires belief is that I really think I have evidence that not only makes it okay for me to believe me, right, it requires me to believe me. So I think that's why they would typically think that this is true. But then you're like, right, so what would that evidence be like? Evidence that doesn't even permit suspension. Don't you have to take that to be something like conclusive evidence? Evidence that settles the question in a particular way. Now, I think the oddity here is that to make sense of this mindset, you have to think, not only do they take themselves to have evidence that settles the question in a particular way, right, by showing that P is true, they have to simultaneously not, as it were, take P to be true or false. And that is a weird kind of unstable mindset, right? I've got conclusive proof that P, but not P. Or, that's bad, but I've got conclusive proof that P, but I don't know whether P. That also seems kind of bad. So, it's hard to make sense of how that could be a rational combination, taking yourself to have the evidence that not just permits, but requires you to believe something. That looks like taking the evidence to be something that shows that something is so. That looks a lot like taking something to be true. But remember, by hypothesis, they're like that. And the kicker, right, that's what rationality sanctions. I just find that a sort of very odd kind of mindset. Now, objectivism then might seem like the best of the bad bunch. Objectivists recognize the incredible requirement. They avoid objections to incoherentism. And the argument from perspectivism that sort of washes away all of the requirements of rationality, that's blocked at the outset. The objectivist just doesn't think that internal connections between the features of your perspective that typically make beliefs rational and the beliefs are enough to guarantee that your beliefs about rationality hit an independent target. And so they think, right, so those things don't necessarily guarantee that beliefs are rational. I mean, it might help to have an actual view on the table. So I don't know how sympathetic people are to phenomenal conservatism, but just think about this view. So, right, one thing phenomenal conservatives typically think is there are these mental states called seemings. There could be these intellectual seemings where something seems to be true. Intellectually, there's perceptual seemings and things like that. So, you might have had this view, which is sort of like, well, if it seems to me, intellectually, that conciliatory views of disagreement are the right ones, maybe it's rational for me to believe that then. It's a little bit weird for me to have this apparent rational insight and be totally unmoved by it. Or to have two apparent rational insights that sort of seem equally vivid, whatever that means, but only be moved by a little bit by one and a lot by the other. So you think, right, so maybe that's the kind of thing that if I get the apparent rational insight in mind, maybe that's the kind of thing that should make me accept things like the conciliatory view of disagreement or think about lottery propositions or whatever. But that's just what the objectivist denies. The objectivist thinks, look, even if these apparent rational insights move a proposition above that line, that is not the significant issue. There's the further question about whether this belief about rationality hits an independent target, and that's not settled by the claim that you have an apparent rational insight. Now, doesn't this, so it looks like we can say that the claim about strong evidence doesn't settle whether these beliefs about rationality are permitted or required, but then you think, right, so doesn't this point to obvious problems with the objectivist view? The only defense we've seen of the Socratic requirement is a kind of a bunch of intuitions that supported perspectivism, right? We're supposed to reject top-down reasoning. So I guess I want to do a couple things. So one, I'm going to say something quickly about the intelligibility argument. I think there's a lot to say about it, but I'm just going to say it quickly. And then once we see why I think the intelligibility argument is not very good, respond to the thing about the Socratic requirement. So remember, the intelligibility thesis is something like this. If phi is a rational response to the situation, then phi is an intelligible response to the situation. Now that seems pretty good, right? That if you can't be rational in going left, if going left is utterly unintelligible from your point of view, you can't be rational to believe things about lottery propositions if such beliefs are utterly unintelligible from your point of view. And then there's the availability thesis. In any situation where there's at least one rationally permitted response to the situation. It's kind of like the no dilemmas claim. Now taken together, these imply that in any given situation there's at least one response that's going to be rationally intelligible. Right? But, without the availability thesis, the intelligibility argument doesn't go through, because what that argument is supposed to do is argue by elimination. Since this is ruled out, this must be kosher. Right? But if the availability thesis is false, they could all be bad. Right? So you need the availability thesis, and you need the intelligibility thesis to say, well, since this is unintelligible, this must be the kosher one. But, one thing you might worry about is whether those two claims are actually compatible. Right? Because it looks like whether something's an intelligible response to you depends upon things like what you can discern and what you can understand, and what sense you can make of your situation. That seems to depend a lot upon what your capacities for understanding are like. Right? The no dilemmas thing, right, that has nothing to do with what your particular sensibilities or understanding is like at all. So you're taking these two things and gluing them together, and you might get weird results. So what rules out the possibility, for example, of just being in a muddle? A situation where, because of your own confusion and muddled thinking, none of your options are intelligible to you. Why is that not possible? Can't people just get so confused about the kinds of situations they face that no response to that situation makes any sense to them? If that's a possibility, right, you can't accept both the availability thesis and the intelligibility thesis. They're just going to be incompatible. Now, one thing I think that the objectivists can do here is to say, look, I don't think together those work very well, but maybe there's a more modest availability thesis that's better. It's something like, if you find yourself in a situation that isn't the result of some rational failure on your part, then maybe there's at least one rationally permitted response to the situation. Maybe that's a bit better. But then notice that this weakened availability thesis doesn't support their perspectivism. So you and a peer disagree about, say, lottery propositions. If you both judge in keeping with your view that the lottery proposition is either one you're required to believe or forbidden from believing, the objectivist thinks one of you, right, is in that situation because of a rational failure on your part. That's what the fixed point thesis says. Right? So the nice thing about the fixed point thesis is that you can say, look, yeah, the modest availability thesis is right, because whenever you made a mistake about what rationality requires of you, you're in that situation because of a rational failure on your part. So yes, there's an availability thesis that we can accept. That's the good one. There's a stronger one that the argument requires. I can't give you that one, but that one's terrible anyway. But then you think, right, but where is the rational failure, right? Because after all, if you followed the evidence in forming your beliefs about lottery propositions, how could this be that this is a case of rational failure? The objectivist thinks this is kind of like a case of perplexity secundum quid. I got excited because there's this medieval distinction between perplexity simplicator, which is like the dilemmas you get yourself in without any fault of your own, and secundum quid, where you get there through your own sort of wrongdoing. And the thing I'm suggesting is that the objectivist should say things like, well, whenever you make a mistake about rationality, you're in a secundum quid kind of situation. You made the mistake about rationality, with no one to blame but yourself. So what we need is an explanation as to why false beliefs about the requirements of rationality are themselves rational failings. Now here's what Teitelbaum says. He says, the reason that mistaken beliefs about rationality is that the justificatory map is arranged in such a way that we don't have justification for believing falsehoods about the requirements of rationality, and every agent possesses a priori propositional justification for true beliefs about the requirements of rationality in our situation. So it looks like what he's doing is something like this, saying, look, The reason that all the false beliefs about the requirements of rationality count as irrational is it just so happens to be that we're structured that for any of the true propositions what rationality requires, those things are up here. For everyone. Now, I'm a little bit skeptical about this, because I would have thought that whether you have evidence that puts these things up here or not depends upon a lot of contingent features of your psychology, the things you've considered, the things that strike you intuitive, the reasoning you've engaged in, the reasoning you didn't engage in, those kinds of things. As the arguments come in, it looks like these things should be able to move up and down. But if they can move up and down, right, then his explanation for the fixed point thesis doesn't work. His explanation is what I call an assets-based explanation. You can't have rational false beliefs about the requirements of rationality because we all happen to have super good assets that you couldn't discover. Maybe you didn't know you had them, but you did sort of have it. That's not totally crazy about that view. I like the liabilities-based explanation. Just a very quick example. Something will make sense to Americans. Taxes in America are really hard to work out. That's the cultural background we might need for this case. So suppose an accountant watches you while you fill in your forms for the IRS. He says, you ought to take this deduction, you ought to report this kind of income in this way, you shouldn't take that deduction, don't report that income, etc., etc., etc. Right? Looking over your shoulder saying these things as you're working for him. And it happens to be you do all the things that he says you should do and don't do things he says you shouldn't do. And as a result, right, you get hit with a bunch of penalties and audit and you go to jail. Things end up bad. That's the first case. Second case, your neighbor who's in the very same tax situation fills out their forms in the exact same way. But no accountant sitting over their shoulder whispering things in their ear. That's just the way they respond to their situation. And then they end up in the same bad situation as a result. Claim about your neighbor. I'd say that your neighbor manifests a kind of incompetence that shows themselves to be incapable of managing the situation that they're in. They're not suffering from any factual ignorance, right? They're suffering from a kind of ignorance about what to do when the facts present themselves. So they're incompetent in dealing with situations like that. That's why they go to jail. So what about you, though? You're sort of a tricky case, but what about your accountant? Now notice something here. Your accountant isn't filling out tax forms. Your accountant is judging things like you ought to fill them out this way, you shouldn't fill them out that way, etc., etc., etc. My claim is this, that since both the accountant and your neighbor were apprised of all the same facts, right, I want to say that your accountant manifests the same incompetence that your neighbor does. It's manifested in different ways, right? In one case it's manifested in filling out forms, the other one is manifested in sanctioning filling out forms that way. But I want to say that it manifests the very same kind of ignorance. And if it's that kind of ignorance that constitutes incompetence in the case of your neighbor, it constitutes incompetence in the case of your advisor. Right? This has all to do with the liability you take on by committing yourself to a response as appropriate in the situation. Hence, liabilities-based explanation. And I want to say that something similar happens with reasons evidence generally. Rationality requires an understanding of what's required when reasons apply to you. And when your first order attitudes violate those requirements, it manifests the kind of incompetence that merits the charge of irrationality. Well, similarly, when your higher order beliefs about the way to treat those reasons would lead you to violate those requirements, right? It manifests the same kind of incompetence as the first order attitudes. Now, if, as it were, the same incompetence is manifested in two ways, but the presence of that incompetence warrants the charge of irrationality in the case of the first order attitudes, it'll warrant the charge of irrationality in the case of the higher order attitudes. But again, if incompetence makes for irrationality in those cases, now we have an explanation for why both kinds of attitudes are irrational. And that explanation is in place, sort of, as it were, before we think about the evidence you have that supports those beliefs. The fixed point thesis isn't true because we all happen to have evidence for the right list of rational requirements. Rather, it's true because the grounds for saying that someone's attitudes are irrational is that those attitudes reveal a kind of incompetence with respect to the way they handle reasons and their demands. But that's present in both the case of first order beliefs, violate requirements, and higher order beliefs, that those requirements should be violated. Alright, so just very quickly, what does that mean? Well, now there's a very quick argument from objectivism against structural sufficiency. Suppose you have a source that says that rational requirement 1 is a genuine rational requirement, and rational requirement 2 is a genuine requirement. So that source could be apparent rational intuition, it could be testimony, whatever the source is. You could have one source that says these are both rational requirements. Suppose this one's true, this one's false. They're both above the line, so there's both sufficient support for both. The fixed point thesis, however, tells us that the false one counts as not rational, irrational. So we have a counterexample to structural sufficiency if the fixed point thesis is correct. Now, if structural sufficiency is false, that's bad. I think in terms of time, I can't tell you the secret lesson this has for knowledge versus epistemology. It's in there. It's just going to have to be a secret. So you can ask me, going through the bar, like, what's the secret? And I'll shout in your ear, it's this. It's amazing. And then you'll wish you hadn't asked. All right, I'll leave it there. Thanks.